Dreams by Carl Jung. Part 1. Dreams and Psychoanalysis. The Analysis of Dreams. In 1900, Sigmund Freud published in Vienna a voluminous work on the analysis of dreams. Here are the principal results of his investigations. The dream, far from being the confusion of haphazard and meaningless associations it is commonly believed to be, are a result merely of somatic sensations during sleep, as many authors suppose, is an autonomous and meaningful product of psychic activity, susceptible, like all other psychic functions, of a systematic analysis. The organic sensations felt during sleep are not the cause of the dream. They play but a secondary role and furnish only elements, the material, upon which the psyche works. According to Freud, the dream, like every complex psychic product, is a creation, a piece of work which has its motives, its train of antecedent associations, and like any considered action, is the outcome of a logical process, of the competition between various tendencies, and the victory of one tendency over another. Dreaming has a meaning, like everything else we do. It may be objected that all empirical reality is against this theory, since the impression of incoherence and obscurity that dreams make upon us is notorious. Freud calls this sequence of confused images the manifest content of the dream. It is the facade behind which he looks for which is essential, namely, the dream thought or the latent context. One may ask what reason Freud has for thinking that the dream itself is only the facade of a vast edifice, or that in reality has any meaning, or that it really has any meaning. His supposition is not founded upon a dogma, nor upon an a priori idea, but on empiricism alone, namely, the common experience that no psychic or physical fact is accidental. It must have, then, as its train of causes, being always the product of a complicated combination of phenomena. For every existing mental element is the resultant of anterior psychic states and ought in theory to be capable of analysis. Freud applies to the dream the same principle that we always instinctively use when inquiring into the causes of human actions. He asks himself, quite simply, why does this particular person dream this particular thing? He must have his specific reasons, otherwise there would be a breakdown in the law of causality. A child's dream is different from an adult's, just as the dream of an educated man differs from that of an illiterate. There is something individual in the dream. It is in agreement with the psychological disposition of the subject. In what does this psychological disposition consist? It is itself the result of our psychic past. Our present mental state depends upon our history. In each person's past there are elements of different value which determine the psychic constellation. The events which do not awaken any strong emotions have little influence on our thoughts or actions, whereas those which produce strong emotional reactions are of great importance to our subsequent psychological development. These memories, with a strong feeling tone, form complexes of association which are not only long enduring, but are very powerful and closely interlinked. An object which I regard with little interest calls forth few associations and soon vanishes from my intellectual horizon. An object in which, on the contrary, I feel much interest will evoke numerous associations and preoccupy me for a long while. Every emotion produces a more or less extensive complex of associations, which I have called the, quote, feeling-toned complex of ideas, unquote. In studying an individual case history, we always discover that the complex exerts the strongest constellating force, from which we conclude that in analysis we shall meet with it from the start. The complexes appear as the chief components of the psychological disposition in which in every psychic structure. In the dream, for example, we encounter the emotional components, for it is easy to understand that all the products of psychic activity depend above all on the strongest constellating influence. One does not have to look far to find the complex that sets Gretchen and Faust singing. There was a king in Thule, true even to his grave. To him his dying mistress a golden beaker gave. The hidden thought in Gretchen's doubt about is about fate's fidelity. The song, unconsciously chosen by Gretchen, is what we have called the dream material, which corresponds to the secret thought. One might apply this example to the dream, and suppose that Gretchen had not sung but dreamed this romance. In that case, the song, with its tragic story of the loves of a far-off king of old, is the manifest content, and the dream is the facade. Anyone who did not know of Gretchen's secret sorrow would have no idea why she dreamt of this king. But we, who know the dream thought which is her tragic love for Faust, can understand why the dream makes use of this particular song, for it is about the rare faithfulness of the king. Faust is not faithful, and Gretchen would like his faithfulness to her to resemble that of the king in the story. Her dream, in reality her song, expresses in a disguised form the ardent desire of her soul. Here we touch upon the real nature of the feeling-toned complex. It is always a question of a wish and resistance to it. Our life is spent in struggles with the realization of our wishes. All our actions proceed from the wish that something should or should not come to pass. It is for this that we work, for this that we think. If we cannot fulfill a wish in reality, we realize it at least in fantasy. The religious and the philosophic systems of every people and every age are the best proof of this. The thought of immorality, even in philosophic guise, is no more than a wish, and for which philosophy is but a facade, even as Gretchen's song is only the outward form, a beneficent veil drawn over her grief. The dream represents her wish as fulfilled. Freud said that every dream represents the fulfillment of a repressed wish. Carrying our illustration further, we see that in the dream, Faust is replaced by a king. A transformation has taken place. Faust has become the far-off king. The personality of Faust, which has a strong feeling tone, is replaced by a neutral, legendary person. The king is an association by analogy, a symbol for Faust and the mistress for Gretchen. We may ask, what is the purpose of this arrangement? Why Gretchen should dream, so to speak, indirectly about this thought, and why she cannot conceive it clearly and without equivocation? This question is easily answered. Gretchen's sadness contains a thought that no one likes to dwell upon. It would be too painful. Her doubt about Faust's faithfulness is repressed and kept down. It makes its reappearance in the form of a melancholy story, which, although it realizes her wish, is not accompanied by pleasant feelings. Freud says that the wishes which form the dream thought are never desires which one openly admits to oneself, but desires that are repressed because of their painful character, and it is because they are excluded from conscious reflection in the wakened state that they float up indirectly in dreams. This reasoning is not at all surprising if we look at the lives of the saints. One can understand without difficulty the nature of the feelings repressed by St. Catherine of Siena, which reappeared indirectly in the vision of her celestial marriage, and see what are the wishes that manifest themselves more or less symbolically in the visions and temptations of the saints. As we know, there is little difference between the somnambulistic consciousness of the hysteric and the normal dream as there is between the intellectual life of hysterics and that of normal people. Naturally, if we ask someone why he had such and such a dream, what are the secret thoughts expressed in it, he cannot tell us. He will say that he has eaten too much in the evening, and that he was lying on his back, that he had seen or heard this or that the day before, in short, all the things we can read in the numerous scientific books about dreams. As for the dream thought, he does not and he cannot know for it. He cannot know it, for, according to Freud, the thought is repressed because it is too disagreeable. So if anyone solemnly assures us that he has never found in his own dreams any of the things Freud talks about, we can hardly suppress a smile. He has been straining to see things it is impossible to see directly. The dream disguises the repressed complex to prevent it from being recognized. By changing Faust into the King of Thule, the Gretchen renders the situation inoffensive. Freud calls this mechanism, which prevents the repressed thought from showing itself clearly, the censor. The censor is nothing but the resistance which also prevents us in the daytime from following a line of reasoning right to the end. The censor will not allow the thought to pass until it is so disguised that the dreamer is unable to recognize it. If we try to acquaint the dreamer with the thought behind his dreams, he will always oppose us to the same resistance that he opposes his repressed complex. We can now ask ourselves a series of important questions. Above all, what must we do to get behind the facade and into the inside of the house? That is, beyond the manifest content of the dream to the real secret thought behind it. Let us return to our example and suppose that Gretchen is a hysteric patient who comes to consult me about a disagreeable dream. I will suppose, moreover, that I know nothing about her. In this case, I would not waste my time questioning her directly, for as a rule, these intimate sorrows cannot be uncovered without arising the most intense resistance. I would try rather to conduct what I have called an association experiment, which would reveal to me the whole of her love affair, her secret pregnancy, etc. The conclusion would be easy to draw, and I should be able to submit the dream thought to her without hesitation. But one may proceed more prudently. I would ask her, for instance, who is not so faithful as the King of Thule, or who ought to be? This question would very quickly eliminate the situation. In uncomplicated cases such as this, the interpretation or analysis of a dream is limited to a few simple questions. Here is an example of such a case. It concerns a man of whom I know nothing except that he lives in the colonies and happens at present to be in Europe on leave. During one of our interviews, he related a dream which had made a profound impression on him. 2 years before, he had dreamed that he was in a wild and desert place, where he saw on a rock a man dressed in black, covering his face with both hands. Suddenly he set out towards a precipice, when a woman, likewise clothed in black, appeared and tried to restrain him. He flung himself onto the abyss, dragging her with him. The dreamer awoke with a cry of anguish. The question, who was the man who put himself in the dangerous situation and who dragged a woman to her doom, moved the dreamer deeply. For that man was the dreamer himself. 2 years before, he had been on a journey of exploration across a rocky and desert land. His expedition was pursued relentlessly by savage inhabitants of that country, who at night made attacks in which several of its members perished. He had undertaken this extremely perilous journey because at that time life had no value for him. The feeling he had when he engaged in this adventure was that he was tempting fate, and the reason for his despair? For several years he had lived alone in a country with a very dangerous climate. When on leave in Europe 2.5 years ago, he had made the acquaintance of a young woman. They fell in love, and the young woman wanted to marry him. He knew, however, that he would have to go back into the murderous climate of the tropics, and he had no wish to take the woman there and to condemn her to almost certain death. He therefore broke off his engagement, and after prolonged moral conflicts which plunged him into profound despair, it was in such a state of mind that he started in his perilous journey. The analysis of the dream does not end with this statement, for the wish fulfillment is not yet evident, but I am only citing this dream in order to demonstrate the discovery of an essential complex. The sequel of the analysis is without interest for us. In this case, the dreamer was a frank and courageous man. A little less frankness, or any feeling of unease or mistrust towards me, and the complex, which would not have been admitted. There are even some who would calmly have asserted that the dream had no meaning, and that my question was completely beside the point. In these cases, the resistance is too great, and the complex cannot be brought up from the depths directly into the ordinary consciousness. Generally, the resistance is such that a direct inquiry, unless it is conducted with great experience, leads to no result. By creating the psychoanalytic method, Freud has given us a valuable instrument for resolving or overcoming the most tenacious resistances. This method is practiced in the following manner. One selects some specially striking portion of the dream and then questions the subject about the associations that attach themselves to it. He is directed to say frankly whatever comes into his mind concerning this part of the dream, eliminating as far as possible any criticism. Criticism is nothing but the censor at work. It is the resistance against the complex, and it tends to suppress what is the most important. The subject should therefore say absolutely everything that comes into his head without paying any attention to it. This is always difficult at first, especially in an introspective examination, when his attention cannot be suppressed so far as to eliminate the inhibiting effect of the censor. For it is towards oneself that one has the strongest resistance. The following case demonstrates the course of an analysis against strong resistance. A gentleman of whose intimate life I was ignorant told me the following dream. I found myself in a little room, seated at a table beside Pope Pius X, whose features were far more handsome than they are in reality, which surprised me. I saw on one side of our room a great apartment with a table sumptuously laid and a crowd of ladies in evening dress. Suddenly I felt I needed to urinate, and I went out. On my return the need was repeated, so I went out again, and this happened several times. Finally I woke up, wanting to urinate. The dreamer, a very intelligent and well-educated man, naturally explained this to himself as a dream caused by irritation of the bladder. Indeed, dreams of this class are always so explained. He argued vigorously against the existence of any components of great individual significance in this dream. It is true that the facade of the dream was not very transparent, and I could not know what was hidden behind it. My first deduction was that the dreamer had a strong resistance because he put so much energy into protesting that the dream was meaningless. In consequence, I did not venture to put the indiscreet question, "Why did you compare yourself to the Pope?" I only asked him what ideas he had associated with Pope. The analysis developed as follows. Pope. The Pope lives royally. A well-known student's song. Note that this gentleman was 31 and unmarried. Seated beside the Pope. Just in the same way I was seated at the side of the Sheikh of the Muslim sect, whose guest I was in Arabia. The Sheikh is a sort of Pope. The Pope is a celibate, the Muslim a polygamist. The idea behind the dream seems to be clear. I am a celibate like the Pope, but I would like to have as many wives as the Muslim. I kept silent about these conjectures. The room and the apartment, with the table laid. They are apartments in my cousin's house, where I was present at a large dinner party he gave a fortnight ago. The ladies in the evening dress. At this dinner there were also ladies, my cousin's daughters, girls of marriageable age. Here he stopped. He had no further associations. The appearance of this phenomenon known as mental inhibition, always justifies the conclusion that one has hit an association which arouses strong resistance. So I asked, "And these young women?" "Oh, nothing. Recently one of them was at F. She stayed with us for some time. When she went away, I went to the station with her, along with my sister." Another inhibition. I helped him out by asking, "What happened then?" "Oh, I was just thinking," this thought had evidently been repressed by the censor, "that I had said something to my sister that made us laugh, and I have completely forgotten what it was." In spite of his sincere efforts to remember, it was at first impossible for him to recall what that was. Here we have a very common instance of forgetfulness caused by inhibition. All at once he remembered. "On the way to the station we met a gentleman who greeted us, and whom I seemed to recognize. Later I asked my sister, 'Was that the gentleman who was interested in my cousin's daughter?' She is now engaged to this gentleman, and I must add that the cousin's family was very wealthy, and that the dreamer was interested too, but he was too late." The dinner at the cousin's house. "I shall shortly have to go to the wedding of the two friends of mine. The Pope's features. The nose was exceedingly well formed, and slightly pointed." "Who has a nose like that?" Laughing. "Ha! A young woman I am taking great interest in just now." "Was there anything else noteworthy about the Pope's face?" "Ah, yes, his face. His mouth. It was a very shapely mouth." "Another young woman, who also attracts me, has a mouth like that." This material is sufficient to elucidate a large part of the dream. The Pope is a good example of what Freud would call a condensation. In the first place, he symbolizes the dreamer, a celibate life. Secondly, he is a transformation of the polygamous sheik. Then he is the person seated beside the dreamer during the dinner, that is to say, one or two ladies, in fact, the two ladies who interest the dreamer. But how comes it that this material is associated with the need to urinate? To find the answer to the question, I formulate the situation in this way. You are taking part in a marriage ceremony, and in the presence of a young lady, when you felt you wanted to pass water. True. That did happen to me once. It was very unpleasant. I had been invited to the marriage of a relative when I was about 11. In the church I was sitting next to the girl my own age. The ceremony went on rather a long time, and I began to need to urinate, but I restrained myself until it was too late. I wetted my trousers. The association of marriage with the desire to urinate dates from this event. I will not pursue this analysis, which does not end here, lest this paper should become too long. But what has been said is sufficient to show the technique, the procedure of analysis. Obviously, it is impossible to give the reader a comprehensive survey of these new points of view. The illumination under the psychoanalytic method brings us in the illumination that the psychoanalytic method brings to us is very great, not only for the understanding of dreams, but for that of hysteria and, most important, mental illness. The psychoanalytic method, which is in use everywhere, has already given rise to considerable literature in German. I am persuaded that the study of this method is extremely important, not only for psychiatrists and neurologists, but also for psychologists. The following works are recommended. And here he lists work by Freud. Part 2 of Chapter 1, On the Significance of Number Dreams. The symbolism of numbers, which greatly engaged the philosophic fantasies of earlier centuries, has acquired a fresh interest from the analytical research of Freud and his school. In the material of number dreams, we no longer discover conscious speculations on the symbolic connections between numbers, but rather the unconscious roots of number symbolism. As there is nothing fundamentally new to be offered in this field since the research of Freud, Adler, Stiekel, we must content ourselves with corroborating their experience by citing parallel cases. I have under observation a few cases of this kind, which may be worth reporting for their general interest. The first three examples are from middle-aged men whose conflict of the moment was an extramarital love affair. This dream fragment from which I have taken the symbolic number is: the dreamer shows his season tickets to the conductor. The conductor protests at the high number on the ticket. It was 2,477. The analysis of the dream brought out a rather ungentlemanly reckoning up of the expenses of this love affair, which was foreign to the dreamer's generous nature. His unconscious made use of this in order to resist the affair. The most obvious interpretation would be that this number had a financial significance and origin. A rough estimate of the expenses so far involved led to a number which in fact approached 2,477 francs, and a more careful calculation gave it 2,387 francs, a number which can only arbitrarily be translated into 2,477. I then left the number to the free association of the patient. It occurred to him that in the dream the number appeared divided, 2477. Perhaps it was a telephone number. This conjecture provided incorrect. The next association was that it was the sum of various other numbers. At this point the patient remembered telling me earlier that he had just celebrated the 100th birthday of his mother, and himself, since she was 65, he was 35. Their birthdays fell on the 100th birthday of his mother and himself. Their birthdays fell on the same day. In this way he arrived at the following associations. He was born on 26, his mistress 28, his wife 1, his mother, his father long dead, 26, his 2 children 20, 29, 13. He was born 75, his mistress 85. He was now 36, his mistress 25. In this series of associations is written down in the usual figures, we get the following sum, and so we sum these up, and it comes up to 2,477. This series, which includes all the members of his family, thus gives the number 2,477. Its composition led to a deeper layer of the dream's meaning. The patient was greatly attached to his family, but on the other hand very much in love with his mistress. This caused him severe conflicts. The details of the conductor's appearance, omitted here for the sake of brevity, point to the analyst, for whom the patient both feared and wished firm control, as well as sharp censor of his dependent state. The dream that followed shortly afterwards, much abbreviated. The analyst asked the patient what he had actually did when he was with his mistress. The patient said he gambled, and always on a very high number, 152. The analyst remarked, "You are sadly cheated." Analysis once more revealed a repressed tendency to reckon up the costs of the affair. The monthly expenses amounted to close to 152 francs, actually between 148 and 158. The remark that he was being cheated alluded to the point at issues between himself and his mistress. She asserted that he deflowered her, but he was quite convinced that she was not a virgin and had already been deflowered by someone else at the time when he was seeking her favors and she was refusing him. The word number led to the association size in gloves, size of caliber, for there it is but a short step to the fact that he had noted at the first coitus a remarkable width of the opening instead of the expected resistance of the hymen. This seemed to him proof of the deception. The unconscious naturally used this discovery as a most effective means of resistance against the relationship. The number 152 proved refractory at first to further analysis, but on a later occasion it led to a not so distant idea of a house number followed by these associations. When he first knew her, the lady lived at 17 X Street, and then on 129 Y Street, and then at 48 Z Street. Here the patient realized that he had already gone far beyond 152, for the total was 194. It then occurred to him that For certain reasons, the lady had left 48 Z Street at his instigation, so the total must be 194 minus 48, which equals 146. She was now living at 6A Street, hence it was 146 plus 6 equals 152. Later in the analysis, he had followed the dream. He received a bill from the analyst charging him interest of 1 franc on a sum of 315 francs for delay in payment from the 3rd to the 29th of September. This reproach of meanness and avariciousness leveled at the analyst covered, as analysis approved, a strong unconscious envy. There were several things in the analyst's life that might arouse the envy of the patient. One thing in particular made an impression on him. The analyst had lately had an addition to his family. The disturbed relations between the patient and his wife unfortunately permitted no such expectation in this case. There was therefore ample ground for invidious comparisons. As before, the analysis started by dividing the number 315 into 3, 1, and 5. The patient associated 3 with the fact that the analyst had 3 children, and the recent addition of another 1, and he himself would have had 5 children if all were living. But as it was, he had 3 minus 1 equals 2, for 3 children were stillborn. But these associations were far from exhausting the number symbolism of the dream. The patient marked that the period from the 3rd to the 29th of September comprised 26 days. His next thought was to add this and the remaining numbers together. 26 plus 315 plus 1 equals 342. He then carried out the same operation on 342 as 315, dividing it into 3, 4, and 2, whereas before it came out that the analyst had 3 children, with 1 in addition. The patient would have had 5. Now the meaning was the analyst had 3 children, now who had 3 children now has 4, but the patient has only 2. He remarked that the second number sounded like a rectification of the wish fulfillment of the first. The patient, who had discovered this explanation for himself without my help, declared himself satisfied. His analyst, however, was not. To him it seemed that the above revelations did not exhaust the possibilities determining the unconscious products. In connection with the number 5, the patient had carefully noted that, of the 3 stillborn children, 1 was born in the 9th and 2 in the 7th month. He also emphasized that his wife had had 2 miscarriages, 1 in the 5th week and 1 in the 7th. If we add these figures together, we get the determination of the number 26. 1 child at 7 months, 1 child at 7 months, 1 child at 9 months, 2 miscarriages, 5 plus 7 weeks equals 3 months. Altogether are 26. It seems as if 26 were determined by the number of lost periods of pregnancy. In the dream, the period of 26 days denoted a delay for which the patient was charged 1 franc interest. Owing to the lost pregnancies, he did in fact suffer a delay, for during the time in which the patient knew him, the analyst got ahead by 1 child. 1 franc may therefore mean 1 child. We have already noted the patient's tendency to add together all his children, including the dead ones, in order to outdo his rival. The thought that his analyst had outdone him by 1 child might influence even more strongly the determination of the number 1. We shall therefore follow up this tendency of the patient and continue his number game by adding 26 the 2 successful pregnancies of 9 months each. 26 plus 18 equals 44. Dividing the numbers again into integers, we get 2 plus 6 and 4 plus 4. 2 groups of figures which have only one thing in common, that each gives 8 by addition. It is to be noted that these figures are composed entirely of the months of pregnancy accrued to the patient. If we compare them to the figures indicating the progenitive capacity of the analyst, namely 315 and 342, we observe that the latter, added crosswise, each gives a total of 9. Now 9 minus 8 equals 1. Again, it seems as if the thought of the difference of 1 were associating itself. The patient had remarked earlier that 315 seemed to him a wish fulfillment and 342 a rectification. Letting our fantasy play around, then, we discover the following. difference between the two numbers. 3 times 1 times 5 equals 15. 3 times 4 times 2 equals 24. 24 minus 15 equals 9. Once more, we come upon the significant figure 9, which fits very aptly into this calculus of pregnancies and births. It is difficult to say where the borderline of play begins, necessarily so, for an unconscious product is the creation of sportive fantasy, of that psychic impulse which out of play itself arises. It is repugnant to the scientific mind to indulge in this kind of playfulness, which tails off everywhere in inanity. But we should never forget that the human mind has for thousands of years amused itself with just this kind of game, so it would be no wonder if these tendencies from the distant past gained a hearing in dreams. Even in his waking life, the patient gave free rein to his number fantasies, as the fact of celebrating the 100th birthday shows. Their presence in his dreams is therefore beyond question. For a single example of unconscious determination, exact proofs are lacking. Only the sum of our experiences can corroborate the accuracy of the individual discoveries. In investigating the realm of free creative fantasy, we have to rely more than almost anything else on a broad empiricism, and though this enjoins us on a high degree of modesty with regard to the accuracy of individual results, it by no means obliges us to pass over in silence what has happened and been observed, simply from fear of being execrated as unscientific. There must be no parleying with the superstition phobia of the modern mind, for this is one of the means by which the secrets of the unconscious are kept veiled. It is particularly interesting to see how the problems of the patient were mirrored in the unconscious of his wife. His wife had the following dream. She dreamt, and this is the whole dream. Luke 1:37. Luke 1:37. Analysis of this number showed that she associated as follows. The analyst got one more child. He has 3. If all her children, counting the miscarriages, were living, she would have 7. But now she has only 3 minus 1 equals 2. She wants 1 plus 3 plus 7 equals 11, a twin number, 1 and 1, which expresses her wish that her 2 children had been a pair of twins, for then she would have had the same number of children as the analyst. Her mother once had twins. The hope of getting a child by her husband was very precarious, and this had long since implanted in the unconscious the thought of a second marriage. Other fantasies showed her as finished at 44, i.e., when she reached the climactic. She was now 33, so there were only 11 more years to go until she was 44. This was a significant number, for her father died in his 44th year. Her fantasy of the 44th year thus contained the thought of her father's death. The emphasis of the death of her father corresponded with the repressed fantasy of the death of her husband, who was an obstacle to a second marriage. At this point, the material of Luke 1:37 comes in to help solve the conflict. The dreamer, it must be emphatically remarked, was not at all well up on the Bible, for she had not read it for an incredible time, and was not in the least religious. It would therefore be quite hopeless to rely upon associations here. Her ignorance of the Bible was so great that she did not even know what Luke 1:37 that she did not know that Luke 1:37 could refer only to the Gospel according to St. Luke. When she turned up the New Testament, she opened it instead to the Acts of the Apostles. As Acts 1 has only 26 verses, she took the 7th verse. It is not for you to know the time or the season, which the Father hath put in his own power. But if we turn to Luke 1, 37, we find the Annunciation of the Virgin, 35. The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. 36. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. 37. For with God nothing shall be impossible. The logical continuation of the analysis of Luke 137 requires us to also look up Luke 13:7. There we read, "A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came and sought fruit thereon, and found none." 7. Then he said unto the dresser of the vineyard, Behold, these 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and find none. Cut it down. Why cumbereth it to the ground? The fig tree, since ancient times a symbol of male genitalia, must be cut down on account of his unfruitliness. This passage is in a complete accord with the numerous sadistic fantasies of the dreamer, which are concerned with cutting off or biting off the penis. The illusion of her husband's unfruitful organ is obvious. It was understandable that the dreamer withdrew her libido from her husband, for with her he was impotent, and equally understandable that she had made a regression to her father, which the father hath put unto his own power, and identified with her mother, who has twins. By thus advancing her age, she put her husband in the role of a son or a boy, of an age when impotence is normal. We can also understand who wished to get rid of her husband, who was moreover confirmed by her, earlier analysis. It is therefore only a further confirmation of what has been said if, following up on the material of Luke 137, we turn to Luke 13, we turn to Luke 7, 13, 12. Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. 13. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. 14. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. In the particular psychological situation of the dreamer, the allusion to the raising up of the dead man acquires a pretty significance as the curing of her husband's impotence. Then the whole problem would be solved. There is no need for me to point out in so many words the numerous wish fulfillments contained in this material. The reader can see them for herself. Since the dreamer was totally ignorant of the Bible, Luke 137 must be regarded as a cryptomnesia. Both Flerney and myself have already drawn attention to the important effects of this phenomenon. So far as one can be humanly certain, any manipulation of the material with intent to deceive is out of question in this case. Those familiar with psychoanalysis will know that the whole nature of the material rules out any such suspicion. I am aware that these observations are floating in a sea of uncertainties, but I think it would be wrong to suppress them, for luckier investigators may come after us who will be able to put them into the right perspective, as we cannot do for lack of adequate knowledge. And that's the end of Chapter 1.